Hi, welcome to part 3 of the video build log for the Dynam Turbojet. In this part, we're going to be finishing up the flap assembly, taking a final look at the nose gear, and putting the main parts together to get a good look at the model fully assembled. As you can see, we've dug out both sets of wings. We've got the retractable landing gear mounted, and some of the other wiring as well as the flap servos installed right now. Now there are a couple of things we want to point out to you. First, we've got those retractable servos in. We cut out the area and we've got them mounted nice and flush using the screws from the original plates to mount them into the plastic supports that were below those original plates. They worked out very well. On the other side, you can see that we have the servo mounted the same way and the wheel mounted. Now again, I'm using the E-flite axles for the 10 to 15 size to bolt onto the struts. Both the E-flite struts and these are 3mm struts, and so they fit very nicely. So I mounted the tire onto the axles, put them on there, and then centered them in the bay where the wheels fit in the wing, and then marked it, and then used the rotary cutting disc on my rotary tool to cut off about that much of the strut so that it would all fit in there nice and snug. Now, in mounting these, there's something we need to point out. As you cut that away, you want to be very careful and then just use your hobby knife to make some hatching in that area below the servo, about 1 millimeter deep at a time. I went back and forth, and then scraped out the foam, going at just 1 millimeter or 2. By the time that you get the servo mounted in flush like this, there's only going to be about 2 millimeters of foam between the bottom of that servo and the top of the wing. And so you really didn't want to use a rotary tool or be too aggressive in digging out that area so that you don't go through the top of your wing. You can also see that the hinges on the flaps have dried very nicely. The control rod has stayed in that little sleeve that I put under there, and then the flaps move nice and smooth, and so it worked out very well. I did do a little bit of sanding around those little nubs that I mentioned earlier, and I haven't yet connected the actuator to the mini connector on the servo, but that's looking very well, and it's a really neat way of attaching the flaps so you don't have a second servo horn or a second control horn there on the flap. And so it moves very nicely, and it's going to be a very nice scale appearance with those hinges. Now I'm using the HXT 900 servos, really short servo leads for the flaps, and so as you can see as we look at the wing here that the servo lead, it comes across in the channel that followed along with the aileron servo, but as it gets to the middle where it's going to be going into the area, into the fuselage area, that's where it ended. So I have a lightweight Y-cord that I'm going to bring down through the wing to get to the receiver, but what I'm going to then have to do is insert those couplers in that area, which means I'll be dragging out my hobby knife and making a couple of just cuts around the edge so that those will fit snugly in there, that they'll fit flush with the wing, and that the Y-cord wires and the other wires that are coming from the wing area can go through that channel into the fuselage. The large hole that's in the middle of the wing that we have a foam plug for is there, and you can see as I tilt this up that you'll be able to see a square for you to mount servo if you're using mechanical retracts. Now we're using electrical retracts, and I still plan to run the servo wire down through that hole, so I'll be filling that hole in just a little bit later. If you're using mechanical retracts, that's where the action is going to be. Now I've mentioned we're putting lights on this, and so I used a hacksaw blade to make a couple of cuts along the channel that was just kind of in an extension of the channel that was already molded in the foam. A couple of quick cuts made it 1 millimeter or maybe 2 millimeters deep was all, because the wire that I'm using is very fine. Then I took my hobby knife, carved out a little pocket at the end for the plastic fitting, mounted it, and then used just a little bit of hot glue to secure it. I also put hot glue in a couple of spots along the wiring channel so that the wire wouldn't fall out and would stay secure to the wing. It's important to know that during a couple of stretches of the wing that there are a number of sets of wires going through there. So I used the hacksaw again to deepen some of the channels so that I could get the wires in there. From there to there are 4 sets of wires, 2 lights and 2 servos. And as you go out a little further, there are 2 sets of wires, or 3 sets there, the flaps, the ailerons, and the servos. And so it really can get kind of congested in there. And so I cut those just a little bit deeper, provided a little bit of pressure to make them just a little wider. Then on the for the landing light, what I've done is gone out from the mold mark on the leading edge, again cut with the hacksaw, mounted the plastic fitting, used a drop of hot glue, and have got it sitting there for my landing light, and then put those wires in the channel with the other wires coming from the end of the wing. What I'm going to do now is get the wing ready to glue together. I want to make sure that I got all the wires that I'm going to need on the outside of the airplane out through that tunnel. So I've got the other landing light, I've got the Y cord. In this case, I need to put back into the tunnel, and then I'm going to make sure that I have those connectors secure that are going to fit into that little carve out that I made on top of the tunnel for that all to fit. Okay, we're ready to glue. And again, as before, we're going to be using the glue that came with the kit, the little white tube, and we'll be applying some of the glue along the facings of the various components within that come in contact with each other. Now, the wing has got a couple of little nubs and pockets in it, so it should fit together pretty well. So let's get some glue on those surfaces and see if we can't get all that together. And now we'll get some on the other side. A couple of the pockets that are on the underside of that one. Then we'll just kind of push the pieces together, pull them apart, get a little air in there, make sure the glue spreads around, and get them to hold together tightly. Now that we've got the pieces together, we'll make sure that we've got the wires coming up from that access tunnel through the wing are free, the light wire is free, and we'll grab some blue painter's tape, and we'll just use some tape to tape together the 2 sides of the wing, give us a little extra support there. I'm really not interested in spending 20 minutes sitting there on the at the table holding those wings together, so we'll use some tape to help us out there. Okay, let's turn our attention to the fuselage for just a minute. As I mentioned, we're putting lights on this, and so in this case we're just going to put our LED top strobe on. There's the little plastic mounting bracket that comes with it. I've drilled a hole just using a thumb vise through the top of the fuselage, as that's where I'm going to place this this LED. I'm not going to try to cut through the top of the vertical stabilizer. It's just be a mess, and so I'm just going to mount that strobe on the top of the fuselage right there. I'll follow up there with a little bit of hot glue in a little bit, and then comes mounting the horizontal stabilizer and the vertical stabilizer, the tail feathers. It comes here. We glued that together earlier, you may recall. And in this case it screws in, so I'm not going to be using any glue, and just going to be sliding that in, making sure that it fits. It does. It fits pretty well. And then I'm going to be looking at the control rods. Obviously there's only one on this side, and that's for the elevator. This one, I'm not sure what it is, so I'm going to take a peek and what wiggles when I push on it inside the fuselage here itself. So, okay, that's the other elevator. So that's the inner of the 2 in this particular assembly. So that's right there. So I'm going to mount the tail feathers, get those in there, and they fit pretty well. And I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to back the screws out of these little mini connectors and try to slide them in as I go in. So I'm going to slide this first elevator into the elevator line right there. I've got the rudder aligned. Put that in through the rudder, and then come around to this side and get the other elevator control rod. There we go. I've got those in there, push those down. And I can just reverse this like so, and then use the screws and get the tail feathers attached. It's nice and tight too. And so now we've got the tail feathers on, looking pretty good. Nice and straight. Motor things, nacelles are attached, nice and smooth, and we've got the control rod. So I'm just going to flip this over now, tighten up the screws, trying to hold these as close as I can to being level, and then recognizing that I'll probably end up having to do a little bit of adjusting after I get it airborne and get it all trimmed out to see that I've got these control surfaces all trimmed up mechanically as well as I can before I use the sub-trims on the radio. So light on the top. I've got to drill through the bottom of the wing to put the bottom strobe on. Got the control rods hooked up very easily, and so the fuselage is pretty much good to go. Now that we're about ready to put this together, I want to point out some of the massive wires and stuff that are down there in this area. First, I wanted to point out the light controller. That's this yellow piece right here. Now, with the length of the lights coming from the LEDs on the wing tips, I didn't have a lot of room extra wire, and so I chose to mount the light controller right there on the wing saddle where the wires come through from the bottom of the wing. That allowed me to do that without cutting the wire and adding extensions. The lights coming from the fuselage had plenty of wire, and so that wasn't a problem. I also mentioned that I thought I'd probably be putting the flashing strobe on the bottom of the wing, but again, with this mass of wires, I simply chose to put the strobe on the bottom of the fuselage, and you can see it right here. And I used the same technique that I used on the top flashing strobe for this. I'm also using a Spectrum 7000 receiver, so it's a 7-channel receiver to go with my DX7 radio. And I've got that all programmed together, and that proved to be interesting in that I have the aileron set in the aileron channel and in the aux1 channel, and I have the wings for the normal setting, and then I used a mix to mix the aux1 and aileron at 100%. So I have individual control of the aileron. Then I used aux2 for the flaps, and so I have the flaps plugged in through a Y connector that came through the bottom of the wing into the receiver itself there, which allows the flaps to operate. Now, as I talked about before, the way that the flap receptacles are molded in the wing, the flaps work like ailerons. In other words, when you activated the flaps, one went up and one went down. And so I used a flap reverser, and that was a handy little thing. I just used one that was in line and was able to get that in there, so now both go down when the signal comes in. The other thing I used was a flap or a servo rate reducer. And so I put the rate reducer in line before the Y cord, which allows the flaps to go down, and I happened to get one that had 4-second delay or a 4-second throw. And so the flaps take about 4 seconds to move to full, gives it a nice scale-like appearance. The other thing you may notice here is I like to use from Max Products these little receiver switches, and they just simply plug in line between the battery or the BEC coming from the speed controllers and the receiver, which allows you to turn the receiver off and provides a measure of safety. The other thing that I've done is I've placed a UBEC in line as opposed to using the BECs from the speed controllers. And so I have power to the UBEC coming from the battery, going through that, going to the throttle, going to the safety switch right here, which allows the batteries to kind of sit by themselves, powering the electronic speed controls, but the speed control's not getting any signal, and then the speed control's not powering the receiver. That's probably overkill in a model like this with two BECs, but with the larger models with lots of channels and so forth, I just feel better using the external BEC or the UBEC in line instead of the BECs coming from the electronic speed controls. Again, I plan to place the receiver right here on the wing saddle, and then the satellite part of the receiver, I have some Velcro in the fuselage where I plan to place that with the wires going the alternate direction as is often described in the material for these receivers. A couple of other little things to point out before we bring this to a close. You'll see that I've got the stickers on, the decals on the airplane. They're pretty nice. You want to take your time on those. These long decals are easy to wrinkle as you put on, so you want to be careful as you do that. One of the things I wanted to point out was the landing gear. Originally, I had planned to place the landing gear on the plastic that was embedded in the foam that the stock landing gear assembly bolted to. That proved to be pretty low into the fuselage, which meant I would have had to dig out quite a bit of foam for the mechanism of the gear to fit. And I was fearful of weakening the nose. And so I took a couple of 10mm pieces of basswood, similar to the motor mount or stick mount type of wood that you would find in some small electric models, and mounted that on top of the plastic, and then glued and screwed the retract into that wood. Now, on the one side where the steering lever is, I had to bevel the end of that because the steering lever goes up underneath the gear as it retracts. And so there was a little bit of jiggering with that to get that in there. The other thing is that I had planned to use the large, rather fat tire that came with the kit, and that would have meant digging out, again, more foam in the nose for it to fit into the retract position, and I didn't want to do that. And so I got some smaller, thinner tires for the nose gear so they would retract into the space without, again, digging out a lot of extra space. The other thing that you'll notice here is that I made an adapter from some of the banana plug fittings that come with the ESCs in this kit to extend them into DIN, since all of my batteries have DIN connectors on them. You'll also see the extra set of wires coming out of the banana plug side. Those are the power wires going to the internal or BEC or the UBEC that is mounted there in the fuselage as well. Last but not least, I hope you didn't glue the tail feathers in. I mentioned when we put those on that they bolt on. I'd leave them bolted on because you have room to change the size of the battery that you have. So whether you use the 2200 that the kit recommends, or if you maybe choose to use a 4000 or something larger to give yourself some more flight time, there's plenty of room in the nose for you to do that. Plus, you've added the weight of the landing gear in the nose if you put retracts in, and so that means that you're likely to be nose heavy right now. And so by pulling off the tail feathers, that compartment was fairly large, and by taking your hobby knife, you'll be able to cut squares in the base of the foam of the tail and place some lead pieces in there. Great Plains sells it at your local hobby store. I've got some around here. And by putting it at the very tail end of the airplane, you increase the impact of that weight, like a lever in a fulcrum. And so you don't have to put as much extra weight on the airplane to get it to balance because you've got it at the far end of the plane. So at this point, it looks like we're pretty much all done. We'll get a battery in there. I've got the radio programmed in it already, and we'll show you what the retracts and flaps look like. So with everything together, let's take a look at the landing gear in operation. So you can see it works pretty well. We've got a certain amount of foam dug out, angles right, and so it's able to come up, come down, get set, have a really nice appearance as it's going to be airborne. And in this case, let's take a look at the flaps coming down. We're going to go right to full. Notice it'll take 3 to 4 seconds with that delay device in the circuit. And half flap, and full flaps, and back to fully retracted. I hope you found these helpful. We'll finish up with a couple of outside shots in the sunshine and a motor run-up.